Welcome back. Well, it wasn't too long ago that we spoke to our next guest. His name is Philip Slayton. He's a former law school dean and is the author of a book about freedom of speech in Canada called Nothing Left to Lose, an impolite report on the state of freedom in Canada. It was a very interesting discussion. It was well received by our viewers, but who knew that it would be so timely with the wave of cancel culture mobs that we've seen since that interview. I think, for example, the case of Barry Weiss, a liberal journalist who was brought into the New York Times to provide a little bit of diversity of opinion and was thrown out, spat out for precisely that reason. Technically, she resigned, but only because, as she described in a powerful letter, she was targeted by others within the Times with attacks, personal attacks, even anti-Semitic attacks, for daring not to toe the woke, intersectional leftist take on everything. And so we brought back our guest, Philip Slayton, to talk about the latest in cancel culture. He joins us now via Skype. Philip, what do you make of the liberal icons who have been tumbling, not just right-wingers or conservatives, but people who style themselves as liberal, who write for liberal bastions like the New York Times? If Barry Weiss is worried about cancel culture, it tells me it's gone pretty far.
Well, I think it has gone far, Ezra. By the way, I'm delighted to be back on your show. I enjoyed it the first time around, and I'm sure I'll enjoy it this time. I think it has gone too far, although I find it somewhat confusing. It's not, the cancel culture is not clearly identified with either the right or the left. Both seem to employ it when it suits them. And it's also not entirely clear to me what is meant by cancel culture. I have no problem with people getting feisty on social media, with people criticizing the views or the careers of people when they do it on social media, even if they do it in a rather intemperate, perhaps even rude way. I mean, we're all grown-ups. We can handle this. If we can't handle this, we should just stay home and not turn on the television or turn on our computer. But the question is, if that's okay, what isn't okay? And I would suggest to you that there's a couple of things that are not okay. It's not okay when what's really happening is an attempt not just to criticize somebody's views or their conduct in a particular case, but to destroy their reputation and destroy their career, in fact, get them fired because they've said something or done something that's not regarded as acceptable. But worst of all, in my view, is the often craven way in which institutions respond to this, by firing people, by issuing apologies when it's not clear what the apology is issued for. And even more distressing in some respects is the way people who are the subject of these kinds of attacks feel obliged to kind of put on sackcloth and ashes and apologize and tell everybody they're going to go away to listen and reflect and learn. To me, that's just a bunch of rubbish.
You know, there was a case, I mean, I agree with you that we should allow feisty debate and even flame wars, as they're called, but that's the point, I think, is that the left doesn't, and I say it's the left because I don't see cancel culture as a traditional or regular tactic on the right. I challenge anyone to tell me a case of a conservative-leaning campus group trying to ban a leftist speaker from campus or shut down a leftist club on campus. I've just never seen it, whereas the reverse is almost universally true. But let me give you an example. So I wish that it was feisty debates. I wish it was rollicking, elbows up, arguing. I don't think that's there. We have safe spaces and trigger warnings now. I mean, for God's sakes, the chain of newspapers in Atlantic, Canada called Saltwire had a warning on their Canada Day newspaper that there was a Canadian flag inside. They literally had a trigger warning that there was a Canadian flag inside. But let me give you an example that I'd love you to talk about. This is a tweet from the West Midlands Police Department, which is in the UK. It's Birmingham and whatnot. And they're boasting, they're bragging, they're gleeful in announcing that they literally arrested a 12-year-old for making racially insensitive comments on social media about a professional football. That's what they call soccer over there. They boasted that they arrested him, that they found him and arrested him. They later, in a subsequent tweet, said that the footballer in question never even complained. He didn't know about it. It was just some 12-year-old saying some rude words online. You know, maybe he deserves a spanking, but the cops boasted they arrest him. I think that's part of cancel culture.
Well, I mean, what I think is it's absurd, and if it weren't so dangerous, I suppose, it would be humorous. I mean, for God's sake, it's clearly ridiculous. But I'm not so much agitated with that kind of bizarre case, which I'm sure will attract a lot of negative attention and probably lead to an apology by the police department and perhaps the sacking of the police officers involved. I'm more concerned with the case I just read about, for example, before I came on your show, about the longtime director of the San Francisco Museum of Fine Art, who's just been forced to resign because he said that despite what was going on in the United States and the world of culture in general, the international world of culture, he was still interested in acquiring works of art by white men. He wasn't going to rule that out as a possibility or as a tactic in the future. And this comment was met with outrage, and a lot of the staff of the museum said his departure was non-negotiable. This gentleman may have used language that wasn't too clever, perhaps, or he may have not thought all that carefully about how he positioned himself. But what he said was, to me at least, entirely reasonable, and now he's gone. A major cultural figure who apparently did a splendid job is gone because of that. And we've seen other examples of this around the world and indeed in our own country. And when that happens, I think this thing is out of control. But the question, Ezra, is how do you rein it in? I mean, how do you stop this sort of nonsense happening? And I think, as I suggested to you earlier, that part of it is the responsibility of institutions, of universities, for example, or the CBC, for example, to stand up to this, to be able to make a judgment as to when the criticism is leveled, the attempt to cancel someone's career and identity is perhaps legitimate, which it may be sometimes, not often, I think, but sometimes, and when it clearly isn't. When it isn't legitimate, to reject the attack and stand behind the person who is being attacked.
That's an excerpt from my daily show, the Ezra Levant Show. Every day I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview an interesting guest, and then I read my hate mail. You gotta subscribe. Go to rebelnews.com.